Hello viewers and listeners. Today we are talking about big data, data mining and Foresight. And our guest is Boysen. Boysen is the founder of After the Millennials Consulting LLC and an analyst at a top-tier tech company. As a futurist, speaker and analyst, she's helped Fortune 500 companies, small businesses, non-profits to prepare for tomorrow and for entrance of a new generation, both as a solo consultant and in collaboration with inspiring teams. Her research has brought her to numerous countries on 3 different continents as a keynote speaker, and she's received the attention of media outlets such as BBC Capital, EI, Paris, Deutsche Welle, The Verge, Vox, Ad Age, Motherboard, and more, and driven by an appetite for learning how different people navigate their lives in time of rapid changes. Anne, hello and welcome to my show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Anne, in the beginning, I want to start with a story. Could you tell us the story about how your Foresight helped a company or a person?
Not sure if I have one specific story, but I have a common theme that I consider a success criteria. To begin with, foresight is very difficult to measure, the impact of foresight. And much of that has to do with the various trajectories that an organization, a company, a person can be faced with. And much of the work is just as much to create that future or avoid a trajectory that otherwise could have occurred. So it's very difficult to find that out eventually. How do you compare it? So, for example, one example is now during this pandemic where we have projections to how this disease, this COVID-19 is going to unfold, the toll it's going to take on people. But precisely because we're mitigating now, we are preventing some of that future from happening. So this is a phenomenon in foresight as well. But if there is a common theme that I consider personally a success factor, it's probably when I feel that I have been able to create a better understanding inside of an organization about how many opportunities they really do have to kind of expand their mindset away from the current trajectory, away from the regular type of thinking, and for them to see opportunities where they might not have perceived opportunities in the past. The other big success criteria, since I work specifically with generational change, I also work with diversity and inclusion issues, is when I can dispel myths, because I think a lot of the conventional wisdom that keeps thriving in organizational cultures and in news headlines are ideas about the truth, ideas about reality that may not be so reflected in the data. So when I'm able to pull together data and garner an understanding inside an organization that there is so much more here. There is so much more opportunity, and also the way that I've viewed a certain group of people might not be the way it is. Maybe it's a little bit more room for collaboration. We tend to focus on everything that is divisive, but I really do think that it's time to focus more on what combines us.
And tell us, please, data mining and data gathering, it's about working hard or working smart?
So I would say that sometimes in the beginning it's about working hard. I'm not going to lie about that. And that is because, first of all, you have to have a strategy for how you come up with the data, what type of data is important for your organization. And then you have to figure out a way to make all of those data points compatible with one another. So you have different types of data. You have structured and unstructured. You have different types of data in different databases, and it turns out that many organizations even there's errors. So in order to have a good data mining strategy, you need to have a very candid look at what you have internally in your organization, and then it's the macro environment. It's the all of the data that you get about the environment that you are operating in. So in the beginning, it can be a little bit of groundwork. However, once that's done, once you have built the infrastructure, once you kind of have the pipelines, it's about process, and it's about processing whatever is coming in. We talk about the various V's, the 4 V's of volume, veracity, velocity, and variety of data. And so once you have built the infrastructure to accommodate for the flow, then you're in a much better position than if you weren't. But it's not a solution. It's not like you become Cassandra just because you have all of this data, but it's very helpful for organizations to have a strategy around it.
Okay, and tell us please, what types of data exists?
So data is everywhere. Anything is anything that it contains information or what can be transformed to information is data. So whether you look at a binary code, or you look at just things in your environment that has not been encoded yet into a structure that you can process with a computer, it is still data. So it's really about the tools you have to harness that data, but also what is useful for you. Because I think that as many companies are moving into developing their digital strategies, they're saying, oh, we have all this data. What are we going to do with all this data? Well, maybe not all of that data is useful. So it's about finding out what is useful for you, and to try to think of what data is useful in different circumstances and different situations. So, for example, one thing is just getting a handle of the internal databases that exist in an organization. So we're used to that, like with CRM databases and POS databases, where businesses are looking more directly at how is the customer journey, how can we increase sales to these and these people. Well, I mean, there are other ways to use that same data to get insight, more of like long-term insights. What is the bigger story behind the more immediate, who am I going to send the next email campaign to? There's a bigger story here. Can you use that insight in a meaningful way to maybe create a greater strategy for the future? So that's one type of data. And then you have all of the data that just exists, for example, on the internet, like text-based data, images, I almost said voice. I don't think that there's a publicly shareable voice database, but you really can use, it's just a matter of how you are, creating your algorithms. However, there are ethical minefields to just use, available data just because it's available to you is not necessarily ethical. So there are privacy issues you need to look into. The good thing now is that there are various privatization or private and anonymization strategies which make it possible for all of this aggregate level data to be used in meaningful ways without revealing individuals. So I think that's another very important thing. But just one example of how a new way of using data created a great success. If you look at Amazon's early years, one of the reasons that Amazon stuck out from other booksellers back when they were in the business of selling books was because of the recommender system. So again, it wasn't data that was only unique to Amazon. It was just a new way of looking at data, a new way of looking at sales data, and finding out using a very simple algorithm, if you're likely to buy this, you're also likely to buy that. And of course now that's all it is, like every businesses are using that now. But there was a time when that was considered fairly new and innovative. So.
Oh, amazing. The explosion of big data and analytics tools in recent years brought to us new opportunities in the field of foresight. Could you name the directions of these opportunities?
I think most of the most useful application of big data approaches in foresight is to expand the knowledge base. It's not so much to use artificial intelligence to predict various futures. And I think that is something that very often gets confused, that when we talk about predictive analytics, which is one way of processing data in a very common way, it's a form of supervised learning, very often involving neural networks. But there are many other ways to use it. And I think that many people believe that, okay, the future is way too complex that you can predict it. So the traditional way of using data mining might not be applicable mostly in that regard. So it's more front-loaded. So in order to get a knowledge base, to know what's really going on, to envision how different data points and different phenomena are related to one another. Are they a clustering? Do you see certain clusters of certain phenomena? Can you find a weak signal of a change somewhere? And it turns out that data-driven methods are better than humans in doing that. It can process more data and it can have a more sort of neutral approach to how it analyzes that. So in Foresight, we have something, one of the methodologies is called horizon scanning or environmental scanning, and that is the way that Foresight professionals are gaining a lot of insight over a vast, cover a vast area of potential domains for change. So another common term in Foresight is STEEP, which stands for social, technological, environmental, economic, and and political. And these are the various domains that a futurist need to stay on top of. And obviously, it's impossible for the human mind to stay on top of everything that happens in all of these domains. So that's very useful to use data-driven insight gathering to monitor change in those domains.
Yeah, very interesting. And for data mining and for data environmental scanning, what kind of tools do you use?
So I use sometimes I use a natural language processing and natural language understanding to process free texts that I can use on my end to see patterns, everything from word associations to frequency to sentiment analysis. I sometimes use the existing databases of my clients to see if I can observe patterns. I use unsupervised machine learning, different cluster-based techniques, different anomaly detection. One of the areas that I'm excited about that I think is coming up, and I don't have personally much experience here, but that is actually to examine images. A lot more public opinion is expressed using images far more often now than, especially with younger generations. And I think that's a very interesting area to look more deeply into. I also use surveys. I do think that you can gain a lot of insights from surveys. it's the way that you ask the questions. That came from a survey background many years ago, and I think that still has some validity. And then I also think there are types of forecasting tools that is helpful if we consider the possibility that there are too much noise in the environment that an unfolding trend is going to operate in, so that we have to think of various trajectories. But there are ways to forecast an S-curve and kind of get a sense of when a trend will be saturated. So, and that's very often used. Many people in Foresight are very clear about the distinction between foresight and forecasting, and I try to be very cognizant of that. But there are ways to do that in terms of forecasting.
Could you explain us the core methods of Foresight?
So there are everything that goes that starts with gaining the data or gaining insights. It always starts with getting an understanding of what's happening today. And then you can use various scenario tools. You have various ways in trying to anticipate how various futures might occur. And then, so there's one approach called Three Horizon, where you look at the future in sort of three different ways, like what is more likely to happen in a near-term future, which is a little bit more predictable, and you have sort of like a middle stage where things are transitioning, and then there's the long-term future. And it's about finding the seeds of change early to kind of anticipate what's going to happen in the more further ahead. And then there's so I think that many futurists would say that one of the core, again, it goes back to how do you measure foresight. It's not so much in seeing how well did you predict the future, because again, prediction is fairly impossible. You're operating in a very complex environment, but it is to have impacted an organization to think about change differently. It's to make to help your clients investigate the underlying assumptions that they have about change, looking at some of the deeper issues, finding causal relationships. And if you can do that both with logic and heuristics and support that with a data-driven approach, I think that you have created a much more solid environment for an organization to move into the future. So it's not so much in having the right strategy, it's more having a very good contingency plan, knowing that the most likely future you think is going to happen is not going to happen. It's almost statistically impossible for that future to happen, but then you have kind of thought through various courses of events so that you're more prepared to handle the future.
Okay. And what are the most popular companies' needs in Foresight, and what kind of work companies usually ask you to do for them?
In my personal experiences, because of a domain expertise, we can call it that I have developed over the years, is insights into generational change. And it's, I think, so you have various ways of looking at change. So you can look at the change itself, and then you can look at the social response to change. So I've been, I guess, trying to focus more on the latter. So not so much the elements of change, not the fancy new technology, not the breakthrough, the scientific breakthrough. It's more how do we as a species react to those changes. And in that context, I think generational change is very interesting, because once you have a brand new generation with all of their internal idiosyncrasies, when they're entering either the work market, or they're becoming new customers, or they're entering a new life phase, it brings with it some changes that is important to have thought about. And so most of the times when I get called in to organizations to help them, it's to try to help them understand how to navigate this transition, to get better communication between the generations, get better communication between people of different age groups, etc. Not saying that this is what most organizations need the most. I think it's just that that's what comes to me because that's what they're used to. That I do.
Okay. And how do you identify early signals and trends in Foresight process?
So, you have secondary and primary data gathering. And I think that what I mentioned with relationships in relation to data mining, that's more of a primary data tool. But most of the time we use secondary data to try to learn what is new on the horizon. That can be anything from conversations to noticing a new trend to just staying on top of a lot of material and keeping a good reading list. Obviously, what is an early signal might be noise, and we don't really know that. We don't know if an early signal is a sign of something that is actually going to affect a change, or if it's just a fluke, just something that happened, or a fad, or something that didn't stick. And it's impossible to know, but there are various ways to try to follow up on that. You can integrate those. You can start paying more attention to those signs that kind of seem that they're aberrant, that they're a break for the past. They signify difference. So yeah, there's really not one cookie cutter recipe for how you detect, but there's various ways of tracking it. So you have various tracking tools. Yeah.
Okay. And can big data and analytics help to fight with cognitive bias?
Yes, and I think this might be one of the most useful applications of big data in any type of research and planning and foresight. I think that we as humans are not very good at recognizing our own cognitive biases. We are biologically evolved to make quick decisions on very little data. And we are designed in many ways to err on the side of caution, which in our modern days take on some interesting side effects. It means that we are more likely to assume that there's a pattern when in fact it could just be noise, because that helped us survive. Back in the days, you can imagine when we were cave people and we would take a walk over a meadow and we saw something moving in the grass. Now, it could have been the wind, and it's most likely just the wind, but it could have been a snake. So our gut reaction would be to run in the opposite direction and assume that that is a snake. Now, when you're looking, when your job is to look for patterns, that is not a very good calibration to harness to figure out what's really happening, because we are automatically inclined to make those types of mistakes. We're automatically inclined to see patterns because it's so instinctual to us to want to see patterns. And this is where I think that various data mining tools and plain old statistics is very helpful, because it allows us to dispel those ideas. That, again, it goes back to dispelling myths and being able to say that I know that it might look like something, it seems like something, but it really isn't. You've probably seen some of those images where you have an inanimate object and it looks like a face. And we're so inclined to see that as a face. We're so inclined to see that as something more than just random coordination of different shapes. So that's why I think that it's very important to use data-driven approaches, and especially now because the algorithms that we are interacting with on a daily basis have become optimized to exploit these biases. So when you're searching for something or you go on social media, what is coming up in your news feed is based on how the algorithm has figured out who you are. It won't show the same to you as it will show to other people. So we can very quickly be misled to think that this is objective reality, when in fact it's just a curated version of a reality. And if we bring that into our research, it can be potentially dangerous.
And developing big data, what branches of the economy can be disrupted?
Any branch that relies on information. And so I can't really think of any branch that does not rely on information. So it's, back in the early 2000s and 2010s, I think it was common to distinguish between data companies and sort of the more brick and mortar companies like manufacturing and food and beverage and consumer packaged goods, and to not think of those latter as being part of the data industry. I don't think that is possible anymore, because data and information informs everything you do. And it might even be more important for some of these other branches, some of these other sectors, to have a very good digital and data-driven organization, precisely because the supply chain is so much more complicated. They're dealing with physical items, which is more costly. So I really think that absolutely most industries are data companies today.
Great. Who owns data, owns whole world? Are data barons already more powerful than oil barons?
Yeah. I just look at the oil prices today. It's 2 weeks ago, oil prices were negative because just for the storing of oil, which not that is related to data, but to a certain extent it is, because it's really about intangible value or parts of the economy that doesn't. Well, I'm not going to say that data doesn't take up space, because we have huge data centers, so of course it takes up space. But I really do think that today, if you have data, you have insight, you have knowledge, and you can adjust your strategy accordingly. Not to say that there's no caveats, because again, we're stumbling into a lot of potential minefields. There are privacy issues, and I think that what has been common up till now is that data has been used with the objective of maximizing growth, maximizing consumption and production, not so much for the common good, not so much for creating a better, more sustainable Earth, not so much with an eye to eradicating income inequality and exacerbating it instead, actually, because data has been used to fuel hyper-capitalism. But again, we can use that same data to create the future that we really want, a future where we have data-driven approaches to how we can live possibly with less, how we can reduce consumption, how we can get more efficient systems. So again, it's the new oil in the sense that, yes, it can potentially make a company a lot of money. I mean, some of the biggest companies today are are companies that found a way to both harness and use data. But there's nothing that prevents us as a species from using that same data with a different objective. So yeah, I think there's enormous power in data.
Okay, and data analytics methods are valuable because of how it complements, replaces human cognition. Do you agree or disagree with this statement?
Yes, I do agree with that. I know that it's, you know, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think in some cases when companies have just started a data approach and they'll leave everything to the black box algorithm, and they're sort of like, okay, we're going to just throw a lot of data at it, and then we're going to see what comes out on the other side. I think that can be a little bit of a dangerous path to go down, because what you're doing is that you're leaving very important decisions to a machine that has no prior knowledge of how the world works, and with the objectives that we might want to set for ourselves as a company, as a society. So there are being huge injustices carried out by data algorithms. So you certainly want to keep the human involved. You just want to apply data where it does the job the best, and then you want to apply the human to where they apply the job the best. So, for example, in my work and what I envision more for work that has to do with planning, with strategy, and with information gathering, I see it more as a sandwich, that you have humans at the forefront deciding what is the objective functions here, what is it that we're trying to accomplish, how do we design our hunt, if you can call it that. And then you leave it to the machines to process all of that information and possibly sometimes even figure out where to find that information. And then at the end, you have humans deciding how to interpret it. So there's a saying in Foresight I attribute to Gerd Leonhard, who's another famous futurist. I think he was the one who said that humans are good at asking why and or asking questions, and data is very good at answering the questions. So again, you don't want to take that ability to ask questions out of the work project. That's actually perhaps the most important part, is the ability to ask questions. And of course, once you have asked one set of questions, that might operate, or that might initialize a new phase where you ask another set of questions that were based on the previous questions that were answered to you. So it's an ongoing process, and it involves both humans and computers.
Great. Aim, what do you see now in the big data that you even didn't expect to see 3 years ago?
So what has probably been a little bit most surprising to me is not so much that the neural nets are becoming bigger and deeper and more accurate, because one of the most difficult things about big data is actually having access to it. So what is important is to be able to do more with less. And so, you know, now we have gotten better ways of using less data and aiming for artificial intelligence to learn to do more with less data. And that's going to be more important, especially as things changes faster and faster. Because when you, especially for artificial intelligence, when it trains on a data set, it trains on the past. It doesn't train on the future. So when you have a change, you need to be able to very quickly pivot and do something new. So one of the types of, you know, we talk about different types of deep learning. So you have convolutional networks, you have generative adverse GANs. So you have all of these different types of learning. So what I think is interesting is that concept of transfer learning, where a neural network can work on one set of data and basically take the contextual knowledge that it derives from that process and iterate on that in the next process. And that's closer to knowledge than information. And this is possibly where we can see computers becoming what we call smart, because being able to see patterns is not necessarily smart, it's just clever. So transfer learning might actually help us overcome and create artificial intelligence that is able to use less data in a more efficient way. Again, it's a little bit, I don't work on that myself, so the neural nets that I've been able to make are very simple. So I don't really know how you would how you do that, but I think it's a very fascinating in the bigger scheme of things. I think it's very fascinating.
And how do you see the future of big data and foresight industry?
I think we're going to start seeing more merging of those two fields in the future. I think that especially as we're moving more into this more knowledge-based data generation, I think it's going to become, it's going to help foresight practitioners, because they're going to be able to have a better pool of insights so that they can anticipate, not to predict what the future might look like, but to have more tools to use, more insights to use when they envision alternative futures and when they help their clients find solutions and to actually implement in their strategies, so that it's more driven by facts and less driven by heuristics, but more sort of like anchored in fact-based insights. And I think it's going to be essential, because you can just look at myself. I'm biased. I'm imperfect. The information that I read on a daily basis, and I read quite a bit of information, but it's biased. It is curated to me personally, regardless of whether I'm in a research position or just a human and a regular individual. I'm definitely not capable of making all of those distinctions that I should as a researcher. And that's why I need these tools, and that's why I think that most people who are working with information is going to start using data more and more.
And what's your message to people?
Well, always look for the truth. Don't settle with what someone is telling you is the truth. Look for the alternative story. Look for the facts. What actually did happen? Do you have evidence? I think that's very important we live in a information overflowing society there's more information that we can process. And I think that's why we so quickly jump to conclusions. We like to say that millennials are lazy. We like to say that boomers don't know how to use technology. These are some of those tropes that I hear all the time in my generational research. And it's not supported with the data. So again, if you really take the time to look into the data and you carry out the research or you look at those various sources and try to break the algorithms. Don't allow these computer algorithms in your environment to tell you what you should read. You should be the one that decides what information you should process.
And it's my extreme pleasure to have you on my channel. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.